Hey, new bodies, back with episode number 27 in our podcast. We're here for a break from all the cooking episodes we've been doing lately to do another interview, and for some reason, this interview is again with a Canadian. I don't know why, but they've got a lot to say about health and fitness, so I want to bring that to you. So this is our second interview, and we're talking to Alex Hutchinson, who is an author and journalist from Toronto, Canada. He's also a PhD and former member of the Canadian national running team. But you may recognize his name if you subscribe to Runner's World, where he writes the Fast Lane column, or you might read his Sweat Science blog on runnersworld.com. You may recognize him from the Globe and Mail or Canadian Running with his Jockology column, maybe from Popular Mechanics, where he writes a piece on technology there. You may recognize him from his adventure travel writings for the New York Times. You may have seen him in The Walrus, Outside Magazine, Men's Journal, or a variety of other publications. Or you may recognize him from this podcast, where in episode 21, we covered the 10th of our 10 principles, which is to read. And as you may recognize it, Alex's book was one of our must-read recommendations. For me, it's really a seminal core piece of work that I think everyone needs to pick up if you're trying to figure out how can you make fitness not just a regular part of your life, but successful for the goals that you're trying to achieve. So his book is called Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights? Fitness Myths, Training Truths, and Other Surprising Discoveries from the Science of Exercise. And in it, Alex really does this amazing job of looking at what all the researchers know, and probably more importantly, what they don't know about 111 fitness myths, questions, and things that people want to understand better as they get into exercise. And I think the biggest part of it and why I recommend it is not just all the science behind it, but the fact that he makes it super accessible. So you don't need to be scared off that it's going to be over your head just because this guy's a super smart PhD and a successful writer. It's done in a way that everyone can really take the information away and actually do something with. So that's what makes it such a great and pivotal book in my eyes. So you can also follow Alex on Twitter @SweatScience, and you can also check out all that he's got going on his website, alexhutchinson.net. But a huge thank you to Alex for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian, and I really appreciate the kind words.
So first, I just, as a background question, you've got a PhD in physics, but you are very focused on the science of fitness. So how did you get into more of a almost biology type field? Like what brought you to the health and fitness side?
Yeah, I guess it was a question of following my interests. It took me a while to really figure out what my interests were. If I could go back in time, I might study something different in university. I always liked science, but outside of school, I always liked running. I liked exercise. I liked fitness and that kind of thing. So when I became a journalist, which was later in my 20s, one of the goals was to be able to spend more time thinking about things that I would, if you enjoy the things you work on, then it doesn't really feel like work. So I've been consciously trying to create opportunities to write about things that I love. And it just happens that because of my running background and because of my science background, there's a sort of a sweet spot between those two in the science of fitness and the science of exercise, where I've been writing about this area for, gosh, seven or 8 years now. I think there's a lot more out there and a lot more great information out there than there was when I started. I felt like I couldn't find that kind of information, and so I was able to get in a little early and establish a reputation in that area. But it's been a learning process, and I'm still. It's almost like being in school. I read a lot of journal papers, and I often have to then step back and go and understand the basic concepts before I can understand what the paper is saying. So that's basically how I got into this area.
So something you just said about how there wasn't a lot out there yet when you were just starting off, that I think is a great segue into the core of your book, which you've got 111 questions in there, as it says on your website. I didn't notice it being 111, so if people hear that and think, oh my God, that's way too much to read, it's not. But the really big overarching question is in the title, is which comes first, cardio or weights? And I have to say, before I even heard of your book, I was following you in Runner's World, but I didn't know about your book yet. That was a question that I get pretty commonly from my clients is, well, what do I need to do? I want to look like this, or I want to work on that, or I want to achieve this, body mass index, or whatever their goals are, whether they're right or wrong, or great goals or bad goals. Ultimately, people are trying to figure out, what the heck do I need to do when I step into the gym, or if I go buy a piece of equipment or lace up and step outside? And that is such a great core truth of, what the purpose of your book is.
Well, it's funny because when the book came out, which was in 2011, I did a lot of interviews, and one of the inevitable questions was, okay, your book is called "Which Comes First, Cardio or Weights?" So which is it? And it was, I wanted to, I was thinking, oh, I really picked a bad title for my book because, as you know very well, there is no simple answer or single answer. The answer is always, well, it depends. Who are you? What are you trying? Where are you trying to get to, and where are you right now? So it didn't turn out to be a good title in terms of easy sound bites in interviews, but I think it does capture that sort of that uncertainty and the big question of that we all face, even if people who are experienced, and like I still struggle to find the right balance. I'm doing more weights these days than I used to, and I don't know if I'm doing enough. And it is a big question, and we have more information now than I think we did 5 or 10 years ago. But it's still something that we have to keep asking ourselves and keep sort of monitoring. Are we on the right track? Are we moving towards our goals in the right way?
I think a key thing for me about your book is you don't read it and then say, oh, the answer is cardio, or the answer is weights, or if I'm trying to do this, then the answer is that. To me, it's much more about how you educate people. It's the whole, teach a person to fish and they'll eat for the rest of their life versus giving them the fish. You're not giving anyone a fish, you're teaching them how to fish. You're giving all that background information, and you talk through why you would choose cardio first or why you choose weights first and what the implications are for that, in a way that I think people they read it, they take it in, they get it, and they can make use of that info. And that's a huge difference for me. So I personally wouldn't want it to be A or B. I want to understand why I choose one of them.
I think we think along similar terms. I think there's a lot of people out there who kind of want someone just give them a fish, or think they want someone to give them the fish. They think it's that easy. Just tell me what I wanted. Don't bother me with the explanations. Just tell me what simple 7-minute workout I should do 3 times a week. And it's like that. I could tell you that, but it wouldn't be right. Like there's always an oversimplification if we're just trying to tell someone do this exact thing and you'll be okay. So we have to be sort of comfortable with complexity and uncertainty, and that it's the answer depends for a different person, and it takes a little bit of thought to find the right thing for either takes a little bit of thought, or it takes turning to someone who can help you figure out what your goals are and how you can get there. And the fact that just because your friend does this particular workout and it looks like $1 million doesn't mean that's the right workout for you.
It's sort of the difference between if someone just gives you that fish, you might eat for the month and then you'll be done. For me, at least, I want fitness for myself and for those that I work with to endure. And I think that takes that next level of understanding. It's the difference between losing weight for some big event, like, you got a high school reunion next month, versus you want to be in shape for your life. And you're not going to be in shape for your life just doing this, 7-minute workout someone gave you 2 years ago.
Yeah. And that's, if you look at the literature on weight loss, you can find you name any diet, I'll find you a study that says it works, but it's always for the reunion next month. There is a million things that can work in the short term, whether to get fit or to lose weight or whatever goal you have, but finding something that's sustainable that you can maintain for the rest of your life, that's the real challenge. And that's where it repays a little investment in terms of thinking carefully about what you want and how you can create a sustainable plan, rather than just following the latest, whatever the latest fad or popular program is that may get you there for a few weeks or a few months, but may not last for a few years.
So, and I don't mean this to sort of short sell the book and to have people say, well, I don't need to read it now because he gave us all the answers. But if you could pull out some of the key things that if someone heard about them, they really understand, okay, this is the book for me. What's the major takeaway and the reason why someone should be reading this book, and what are they going to get out of it?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the most important thing that I hope someone would take away from the book is that exercise and more generally fitness is just crucially important, absolutely vitally important. So I do spend a little time in the book trying to make the case that that not just for your body, but for your mind, for your mental well-being, for happiness, mood, uh, exercise and a good diet are vital. And so at the end of the book, I have some sort of a few brief takeaways. And the first one is just do something. Like don't get lost in the weeds of should I be doing 8 reps of 12 or 12, 12 sets of 3, or, how 80% of my body weight. And like there's room for those debates. Those are interesting debates, but man, those only once you're doing something, does that matter. So you figure out what to do, or you figure out something that you're comfortable doing, and then you can start sweating the details. And another big lesson that I think, this was something that I took away from the research for the book, because I spent a couple years researching this book, and I've been a runner since high school. But what I took away is, no matter how good the workout you're doing is, if you do it the same one every day, there's the returns they start to diminish, and you're not getting everything you could. So I'm a lot more conscious these days of trying to incorporate variety into my program. So, and that's the opposite of I think there's a big trend in I don't know whether it's in fitness or in human nature to look for magic bullets, and so to look for the workout or the diet, and so even when we're talking about good workouts, um, I think no matter how good the workout is, you want to not do the same one. You want to find variety. You want to um, challenge yourself and learn new things physically and mentally as you're working out. So, in terms of big picture lessons, those are the ones that I hope people take away with. That they should do something, that they should, and that and the other, it's not just what you do, but how much you do. Doing something is better than doing nothing. So if you are busy, if you just have a lot of trouble getting into it, just starting a workout routine, even if it's once or twice a week for 10 or 15 minutes, even if it's taking this, these are cliches, but if taking the stairs at work, or walking a few blocks, getting off one subway stop earlier or whatever. People kind of sneer at some of these things sometimes because you add up, oh, you're only burning 7 more calories, so it doesn't really make a difference. But I think it's really important to start with something that's sustainable and that you can sustain, that you will be willing to continue for a long period of time, and then keep up the variety and just do something. And then, the rest of the book, there's lots of stuff on, should you lift weights to failure, or how many sets, and how much did you run, and what's the difference between elliptical and treadmill? To me, that's all the details. That's why you can buy the book to get the details on that. But the message that I think you're trying to get out there too, and that I think is really important is start and don't get hung up on trying to find the magic formula or anything like that.
That's great. That definitely comes through. As a reader of the book, that that is absolutely there. And as you say, those detailed questions, once you get into the first order questions about do something and helping you figure out what something might be, those detailed questions really come in handy as you start to fine tune and figure out, I've been playing around with this and that, and actually I really enjoy this exercise or that. You've got these deeper questions to help you sort of figure out, now that you're a little bit less of a beginner in it, how do you take it to the next level? So, yeah, really useful.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean it's funny. I write a blog, so the Sweat Science blog, not to plug it, but
You should plug
on
it. It's a great
yeah,
blog.
plug the Sweat Science blog. Everyone should read it, and it really gets into the fine. I'm digging into. It's usually new studies that have come out, and they're often looking at very subtle points, like should you be running at 72% or 75% of your max, or does this high tech recovery tool, does bathing in ultra cold nitrogen vapor help your muscles recover? It's like I find this stuff interesting. Like this is cool stuff, but I find I have to remind people sometimes what we're talking about is the 99th percent. Like we're debating. None of this matters. Like if you're talking about marathon runners, like you don't worry about the liquid nitrogen bath unless you're already running 100 miles a week, right? Like so that's in terms of performance, or in terms of health. It's like, don't worry about which green vegetable is healthier for you unless you're already eating lots of green vegetables. Then you can sweat up which is the very best of this specific type of food. But there people, it's kind of fun to debate these find features, and I find them fascinating, which is why I write about them. But all of that is the, I don't know if it's the 1% or the 5% or the 10%, depending on what we're talking about. But you want to take care of the 90% first, and that stuff is a lot easier than people think. We there's a lot we don't know about how the body works, about what exercise is best. There's the area of stuff we don't know is massive, but the stuff we do know accounts, I think, for a lot of the things we need to worry about. Like, you can get that 90% without worrying about, oh, well, I don't know, are vegetables good for me? Yeah, vegetables are good for you. We can debate other stuff, but exercise is good for you. But this is not a real debate.
So Alex, you work with some of the biggest names in publications. Like, I've mentioned Runner's World a couple of times, which is how I found you in the first place. How did you get into, I'm biased, so I want to know more about Runner's World. How did you get into Runner's World? But, I could say the same thing about the Times and the Globe and Mail and Canadian Running. These are all really marquee publications. So how'd you get into that space?
Well, I mean, I should say, first of all, there was some luck. There was meeting the right people at the right time, but it's also a very gradual process. So I went to journalism school in 2004, and coming out of and then I interned at a newspaper for a year, and then I started freelancing. And when I started freelancing, it was the writing I was doing at that point was the two publications I started out with as clients were The Bottom Line, which is Canada's accounting newsletter, and Lawyers Weekly, which is a publication for Canadian lawyers. And with no disrespect intended to accountants or lawyers, these were not my passion plays. This was writing to pay the bills. And from then it was just a very incremental of sending out query letters and also establishing myself. So in terms of getting into being able to write about running first, for instance, Canadian Running magazine, it started the year I started freelancing, and so they were a startup magazine. So I was able to start gaining some experience and developing a portfolio of stuff by writing for them when they were still very new. And then I started blogging in, I think it was 2008, and that was that ultimately that's to cut to the answer of your question, because sorry, I sort of ramble sometimes. I connected with Runner's World through my blog. Amby Burfoot, who is a real mentor of mine, and just a tremendously, not just a wonderful journalist, but a really important role model for a lot of young journalists. He started to see my blog, and he sort of told people at Runner's World, you should pay attention to this guy. He has interesting things to say. So, I moved my blog to Runner's World in 2012. So I'd been blogging for 4 years at that point. I looked back, and it was an average of, about 4 or 5 times a week. And that was, no one was paying me to blog at that point, and I didn't take any ads or anything at that point. First of all, it was an outlet to share, I was writing some articles by this point, like I said, for places like Canadian Running, but I couldn't always, even today in Runner's World magazine, there's a limit to how much detail you can go into in the magazine itself. So the blog was a place where I could say, well, in the course of researching this article, I came across these 3 studies, and this is pretty cool. Like, maybe this is a new study that tells us something that we never knew. But also, hey, look, here's this study from 1995 that looks back at carbohydrate versus fat burning during endurance running. Here's the key figure from that. I found that really cool. I didn't know about that. Maybe you will too. And so the blog really worked for me. In hindsight, at the time, I sort of was wondering, oh boy, I enjoy writing the blog. Am I spending too much time for zero return? But it ended up working out well that it came to the attention of Runner's World, and then they got in touch yeah.
Well, so the reason I ask is obviously this is not a journalism podcast, but it's because you had a space you really cared about, you were interested in, and you had a goal. Goals don't always have to be fitness minded. I think I might give the impression that every goal is about health and fitness, but here it is. You invested in that long term. You didn't say, I want to be in the magazine by next month. You said, ultimately, I want to be writing about things I genuinely care about. And you put the pieces in place, and it was a long-term investment. And I think any goal that is worth going after and worth achieving, the story is the same. So that's why I was curious to hear that story that, it might seem like divergent from what we usually talk about, but I think it's spot on. And also, any mention of Amby Burfoot, I'm always for. He's fantastic. Such a great writer. His book was also on my list, by the way.
Excellent, yeah.
Yeah, he's great. He's got a great style and just seems like an amazing person. I'm hoping to meet him at the half marathon and Runners Festival this year, this summer.
That's very cool. Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough nice things about Amby, both as a journalist, but just I've had a chance to meet him a few times at some running events since I started working with Runner's World, and yeah, just the nicest guy you can imagine, but also extremely accomplished, a careful journalist, and also just to echo what you just said, I couldn't agree more that you know, goals, any goal that's worthwhile usually takes a long time, um, and I guess the other thing I would say is the importance of enjoying the process. Had I said I want to get into Runner's World, and I think what it will take is 5 years of scratching my eyeballs out. I don't think that would have been worthwhile. Like, whether or not I succeeded, that's not good. But with the blog, what I knew and what was important to me is that I would like to get somewhere like Runner's World. But whatever happens, I'm embarking on a process that is enjoyable to me. The blog, as it grew, I connected with a group of readers and other people interested in the same topics as me, and I had a chance to explore topics that were interesting to me. And so, obviously, I do. You have to be realistic, and I had to bear in mind, okay, I can't sink too much time into something that's not paying me just because I have to make a living as a freelance journalist. But I had no regrets, and had I not ended up in Runner's World as a result of the blog, I certainly wouldn't have regretted the blog because it was a case where the process to me was as important and as enjoyable as the goal or the outcome.
Right. No, it's really inspiring. And just being selfish, I like the content that came out of that whole journey. So I made out like a bandit either way. It's worked out really nicely for me. So you mentioned Amby Barefoot. What would you say from your experience with all these great publications and some just really cool things that you've been involved with? What's sort of the most, if you had a top moment, the most inspiring thing that you've gotten to experience through this career?
Well, with Runner's World, I've had a chance to go to a few pretty cool marathon events, including the last Olympic marathon trials. But probably the one that stands out to me was going to the New York Marathon. And actually, interestingly, it's a toss-up. Like there's, it's hard to pick which was for in some respects the most sort of interesting and inspiring trip was to the New York Marathon the year it got canceled by Hurricane Sandy. I mean, and that was in many respects it was a nightmare trip. Like, it was a really difficult time, and very difficult for the people in New York, obviously. But it was pretty interesting to be at a huge event like that. And I was there that year with a group of first-time marathoners from Australia, Aboriginal runners who were part of a program designed by the former marathon world record holder Rob Di Castella to try and engage the Aboriginal population in Australia, which in general is fairly troubled, and inspire youth to get involved in sports and to run, and ultimately over the course of a 8-month period, they train a dozen people each year to come and run the New York Marathon. So they had flown all the way from Australia, as had I. I was living in Australia at the time, and so we got to New York on the Thursday, only to find out that the race had been canceled, a few minutes earlier, maybe it was canceled the next day. So they were dealing with a pretty disappointing. Well, most of them had never been outside of Australia. So there were multiple things going on that weekend, but just to see how all the marathoners who were there, how they responded to the adversity, and how in particular how these Aboriginal Australians, who were pretty remarkable people, how they responded to what was an incredible disappointment for them, and how they responded by going out and volunteering in some of the storm hit areas, and just being part of that kind of human experience. I guess that's an example of that. Like, I remember talking about running magazines, sorry to digress, but talking about running magazines when I was in university. One of my friends was saying, how can you subscribe to a running magazine? What is there to say other than right, left, right, left, right, left? And I guess experiences like that experience in New York during Hurricane Sandy was a reminder of how running ties into a lot of bigger themes, and how any story that's about running is really about more than about just running. So that was really neat to be there for that. it was supposed to be an inspirational story of them running the marathon, which was going to run in, I can't remember, it was going to run 6 months later or something like that. And I would have plenty of time to craft this lovely narrative. And instead, the hurricane came and Runner's World thought about it and they said, okay, you know what? Our next issue is we're going to throw away the issue that's already in the bank and rush out. I can't remember if it was going to end up being their January issue. It was going to be a New York Marathon special. So I got home from the New York Marathon and I got a phone call saying, okay, this feature that you're supposed to have a couple months on, actually, could we get it in 2 days? So a little shorter, but that was an intense 48 hours. And then they were editing and fact checking and sort of in parallel. So that was my own little marathon, but it was a chance to tell that story while it was still very, very, very fresh in my mind.
Oh, it was an amazing read and incredible story. Along with several others that went in the magazine, but that one did stand out to me, so that was great. A common pushback that I get is that no one has time for being healthy, be it cooking their own food and not just grabbing, McDonald's or whatever junk is on the side of the road that they can pick up, or processed, pre-made, frozen, machine-induced food rather than grown or whatever. No one has time to work out, etc. So you seem to be able to fit that in, including this incredibly busy professional career as well. So I'm curious, through your experiences, how have you made health and fitness a priority, given everything else on your plate?
This is interesting. Often these discussions end up sounding like, someone who's got the right habits just smugly saying, "Oh well, it's all about discipline," and that's not very helpful to people who are trying to make change. But I guess what I would say, what I've found for me, there's a few things. One thing is just the importance of developing habits, because if I had to wake up every morning and decide, how am I going to eat today? Am I going to exercise today? That's a mental battle every morning, and I would lose that battle more often than I won it. So in a sense, I've made my decisions, and I kind of turn off the questioning. I know what I'm doing when I get up. On that note, it's interesting. Like I used to run very competitively, and so that I had a sort of compulsion to, there was no doubt that I was going to train once or twice a day. And once I stopped competing at a serious level, I was sort of like, I'll just run when I feel like it. And so there was a point where I was thinking, I'm going to run, 4 or 5 times a week. And what I found was that was way harder for me than running 7 days a week, because when it was 7 days a week, I just woke up and knew what I had to do. When it was 4 days a week, every morning I'd wake up and say, I'm a little tired today. Maybe I won't run today. Should I? It would be something I'd have to think about. So, and these strategies are individual, but for me, what I've found is doing something, if not every day, then almost every day, is easier for me to just establish the habit, so that I'm not having to make a decision every day. I also find, again, personally for me, fitting in exercise in the morning is way easier. Things happen during the day; they always happen during the day, and there have been times in my life where I do work out in the evening, especially if I'm working out with people. But I find it's easier to find 20 minutes in the day, or if and I'm fortunate that I can I don't mind heading out the door before breakfast or whatever. 20 minutes is not much. 25 minutes. My wife and I were doing workouts earlier this year, running workouts, where we would just head out the door and we would do interval workouts, and we'd be out the door and back in 25 or 30 minutes. And it would have been, if we were trying to wait till after work, it would have been very, very much harder. So those are some, like, practically speaking, for me, just establishing a routine and finding the time of day that works for me were really big factors. But there's a lot of different barriers for different people, and put it this way, like I said, I've run for a long time, and so I've been trying to do other things like weights, and I find somehow it's much easier to discover that I'm too busy to work out when I'm trying to do something that I'm less enthused about, like weights. I've had a lot more struggles getting into a regular routine with something new, whereas with running, I've been doing it for so long that I'm over that sort of hump of that barrier of, it's a struggle, and then it just becomes something you do. And for food, it's I don't have any uh, like secret tricks for food. It's everyone struggles with this. It's one of those things where if you shop, if you have healthy food in the house, then when I'm hungry in the middle, because I work at home, when I get up to get a little snack in the middle of the day, if the easiest thing for me to get is pre-cut carrots or an apple, then I'll have that. And if there's a piece of cake or muffin sitting there, then I'll have that. So it's kind of making decisions in advance to save yourself from your weaker moments or whatever is helpful.
You could almost be a plant for me for the points that I've talked about in earlier podcasts around. One of the key things I have is I've got these 10 principles, and I talk about one of them is don't question it. So it's kind of similar to the just do it Nike idea, but as soon as you present yourself with a question, who would wake up at 4 versus sleeping until, I would say 5, but I think most people would still choose something later. For me, it's 4 or 5, and I just get up and I don't hit snooze. I just go, because if I stop, of course I would rather lay in bed.
Yeah, but of course you'll be happier in the long run if you get up. You'll feel better for the rest of the day, and you'll feel better overall in your life if you do this. So it's a sort of short-term versus long-term trade-off. But you're right. Like if you're making that decision in the moment, it's just a whole different. Everyone has moments of weakness, and when the moment after the alarm goes off is a moment of weakness for everybody. So yeah, if you can just make that decision and just like again, for me, there's lots of mornings, even though I run pretty much every morning, there's lots of mornings where if the weather's out and it's not very good out, and it's been a brutal winter this year, I can't lie and say that I'm enthused about going out for a run every morning, but I've made that decision, and it's like, if I want to change to not running, I'm not going to make that decision in the morning. I can have I make a deal with myself. It's like, look, if I want to reevaluate my fitness plan, we'll do that at another time. But it's the time when I'm about to work out is not the time to decide whether I'm going to work out. At that point, you're just on autopilot, and you just go do it.
I've got one more major question for you, and then if there's anything that you want to share with us. But so I've talked about your book, and that I think it's really crucial for people. Do you have a list? There are a few books, or even one book that you think is, if someone's trying to live a healthier life that includes fitness on a regular basis, is there something that you would say, hey, you got to read this book and take in the message that it's trying to give?
It's interesting. I'll hedge a little bit by saying that I think the great book question is a little bit like the what's the workout question, in that it's different for different people, right? Like depending on the goals. So if I look back at books that had a big influence on me, the first one that I can think of is The Lore of Running by Tim Noakes, which was, to my knowledge, one of the first to try and take all the sort of specialized knowledge about exercise, or in this case about running, and try and present it to a wider audience. And that was published back in the 80s. I got my copy in 1991 when I was in high school, and it really opened my eyes to this. Oh, people study this stuff. This is interesting. They're trying to actually answer these questions that I have about how fast should I run or how far should I run. They're trying to answer them in a scientific way. So that was a real transformative one, and that book is still out there in a revised edition. I certainly, for people who are interested in running, I think that's a great book. Another book that actually had a big influence on me, even though I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what it concludes, is Gary Taubes's book.
The first one or the second?
The first one, Good Calories, Bad Calories, which is the sort of the big doorstopper version of, and then which he then simplified into Why We Get Fat.
Well, simplified and still about 800.
Yeah. No, I should. Yeah. No.
That's one of Why We Get Fat is one of my must-read books as well.
Yeah, I mean, so they have very similar messages. They're just, to me, I read that book and it really made me question a lot of things that I'd taken for granted. That I guess I'm one of those people who tends to respect authority and think, oh, if the such and such association says this, it must be correct. And it made me realize in a sense how little we know about fitness and health and nutrition, and how flimsy some of the evidence that we base some of our conclusions is. Now, Taubes then he has his own theories about how everything works, and I'm not maybe 100% convinced that he's got it 100% right, but he his role in casting a critical eye on the sort of conventional wisdom, I think that was really fantastic. And I think it was, I would say that was one of my inspirations in starting to try and read the studies about topics that I was more interested in, like running. And instead of just sort of relying on people who had read the studies to be the experts, I realized, oh, I can go and I can just read, because Gary Taubes is a former physicist too. He studied physics and then became a journalist. And I thought, oh, if he can read studies on why we get fat, I can read studies on how to run fast. And he was right. You can read these studies. Like they're not written in Latin or anything like that. So I would agree with you. I mean, and I think Why We Get Fat is a more recent and probably a slightly more accessible version. So I think that's worth reading. And the only my only caveat is that I would say to take the spirit that he writes with, which is to be very questioning and to take nothing for granted, and apply that to the book too. So he knocks down a lot of false idols, and I would say, don't take everything he says as the gospel truth too, but understand it as a hypothesis that he and his colleagues are now, or he and the people he works with at his foundation are now trying to establish whether his ideas are true. So I think that's fantastic, and I think that's an interesting book. Those are the two books that really, I think, changed my course most abruptly. There's a book that just came out that I have in terms of health is by a guy named Yoni Friedhoff called The Diet Fix, and he's an obesity doctor in Ottawa who writes a blog called Weighty Matters, and I thought that book was a really excellent, no nonsense look at what's wrong with a lot of dietary approaches and some ways of getting your own diet right, which I think probably coincide a lot with some of the things that you recommend, in that it's not necessarily about magic ingredients or anything, but more about behavior and sustainable goals and figuring out how you're going to make the changes that are going to persist for the rest of your life.
Great. So two definites, and then one that we should watch that's just coming out that is also worth looking at. It's great. Anything else that we should mention before wrapping up? I also want to be respectful of your time. I think I told you this would be like 15 minutes, and we're closing in on 40.
Well, I can take the full blame for that. I tend to ramble on in my answers, and we've covered some great topics, and I there's nothing burning a hole in my pocketbook that I want to get out there. So I appreciate you giving me the time to ramble on and having an interest in these topics, which I think are really fantastic.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and for not just today, but the work that you do in general. It's really, really interesting stuff. I highly encourage people to check out your Sweat Science blog. Obviously, read the columns in Runner's World, Popular Mechanics. I'm reading the list because there's so many of them, and I think people should be checking them out. Globe and Mail, Canadian Running, New York Times, watch for you in other publications like Outside and Men's Journal. And obviously, I've said it many times before, pick up the book. There's a direct link right here. You go to newbodies/which comes first, and it'll take you straight to Amazon to buy the book, so you have no excuses. Pick it up, read it, and start making this stuff help you on a daily basis enlighten your body. Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I really enjoyed it.